Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It will just be a few moments before we get started. Good morning. Good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Sunnyvale Mayor Larry Klein, and thanks for joining me again this week. You know, it's been a rainy week, but I think the rain is a very welcome occurrence after almost the drought conditions we've had over the last 6 months, to say the least. This is the 46th installment of my weekly virtual office hour address, and people continue to say they appreciate these weekly live stream addresses and hearing from their mayor. So I'll continue to do them. This live stream is really good because it allows me to give you some updates, answer some of your questions, and of course, just provide some general words of encouragement. So thank you for allowing me to continue to represent you and work for Sunnyvale during these ever-changing times that we're living in. It looks like we're, with the rain, I know it's been a little chilly out, but we're having a little sun today, and I think it should be a good weekend. So looking forward to that. Hope everyone's doing well, staying healthy. Please remember to take care of yourself, both physically and mentally. These are very difficult times, and there's that general fatigue of staying at home. From that standpoint, at least, we are starting to see the COVID vaccine rollout, and so it's actually been a little positive to see people that I know getting vaccinated. So hopefully that becomes a lot more available in the next month or two. And we'll talk a little bit about vaccines a little bit later. But in the meantime, keep following the county health orders. Do your part to stop the spread of the virus. Wash your hands, don't touch your face. Reduce the number of people you come in contact with, and of course, wear your mask. It's really important. It helps. It's mandatory, but it does make a big difference. There's been a lot of new studies coming out that maybe two levels of mask, and certain people are wearing the K95 mask right now. So definitely do what you can to protect yourself and protect others. There's been at least a general kind of leveling out, or at least a little bit less of an uptick from the number of people infected. We're still seeing a lot, but at least it's dropped in the last few weeks. So we'll talk a little bit about that more later. We've now reached 319 days since the March 16th county health order started the shelter in place in that attempt to slow the spread of COVID-19. So rapidly coming up on the 1 year mark. And since that first declaration, a lot has happened. A lot more happens every day. I have press conferences to watch, seminars to attend, and of course conference calls to confer and advocate on your behalf. Let's go ahead and get started and talk about what's happened at a federal, state, county, and city level over the last 2 weeks. And 2 weeks ago, Biden unveiled his $1.9 trillion coronavirus economic plan, and that included $1,400 stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, $440 billion in small business, first responder, transit agency benefits, and funding, $400 billion in national vaccination program, and a general plan for opening schools. So some of that has been moved forward, and we'll hear more about that in the upcoming weeks. And of course, the goal for 100 million shots by the end of the 100 days. So definitely there are some executive orders as far as production were put in place, and I think it becomes production and distribution. The state has been trying to do a lot more. So it'll be interesting to see how the next few weeks go. Last Wednesday was Inauguration Day. A lot of people were watching TV and watching the peaceful transfer of power. Congratulations to President Biden and Vice President Harris. There's been a lot better representation, I think, in the new administration from California and especially the Bay Area. So I do think it'll be positive from that standpoint. Let's see how things go. There were a lot of executive orders, and I haven't went through all of them. We've rejoined the Paris Treaty for dealing with the environment. So one of the things that I did as a mayor was join that, and so joined a lot of mayors in making sure that we're doing whatever we can to basically reduce our greenhouse gases. And that was one of the things that we've done, adding additional, and so rejoining the World Health Organization. There's lots of things that the president has done in the last week, and trying to keep up with all those has been a little difficult, to say the least. And then on Sunday, word started trickling out that the regional health orders were coming to an end. And if you remember, about beginning in December, the entire state moved into regional health orders, and part of that was looking at the ICU capacity in especially Southern California, the Central Valley. It was close to zero and was reaching zero very soon after that. And so putting the state into kind of a regional order based upon ICU capacity was critical. And from that standpoint, on Sunday, the ICU availability for the Bay Area had shot up to 23%, which I still have questions about, but that's what the state numbers were looking at. And so there were a lot of questions about what those numbers were. On Monday, Governor Newsom then moved the entire state out of the regional health orders. And while I think that was good for the majority of the state, I do think that Southern California, which still had ICU capacities close to zero or at zero, didn't really make sense. We'll see. Um, but it's projected on a 4-week basis, and Sacramento was moved out about out of the regional health order about 2 weeks ago, assuming that in with their projections that in 4 weeks they would be at 19% ICU capacity. I think they're just around 10% now, but as of Monday, the projections around the state for the Bay Area, they expected us to be around 29%, or 26% ICU capacity. Surprisingly, Southern California was estimated to be at 33%. So I still have some question about those projections, but I do think moving back to the purple tier is important. We do have improved ICU capacity within our county, within our region. So I do think that that's important. And the purple tier, going back to the purple tier, is as you remember, allows for, most importantly, outdoor dining. And so we've already had some restaurants opening up for outdoor dining. It allows gyms to open with reduced capacity, outdoor operation. It also allows hair and nail salons to reopen, of course, with the same limitations that they had before. And one of the new things that was added was new guidance based upon youth and professional sports. And so those were allowed to restart. Youth sports teams will be allowed to hold distance workouts, and then counties in the purple tier can resume competitions of certain sports that the state classifies as low contact. And so those are like cross country, track and field, golf, swimming. So those were the guidelines from the state. Baseball and softball for counties that reach the red tier, and then if you make it into the yellow tier, that's when basketball, football can resume. So the high contact sports at that point. The governor also on Monday announced that the legislature had reached an agreement to extend the eviction moratorium through June 30th. And then, of course, talked about ICU rates around the state, but most importantly about getting vaccines out. And so there'll be a new website that the state is putting together, for one thing, reporting what the vaccines are, but then having people sign up to basically get notified when they are available for the vaccine. And so one of the things that had been done in the last week, and we talked about last week, was lowering the age from 75 to 65 for those people that can get vaccinated. But because of all the issues with not having enough vaccines, or the vaccine distribution, that really wasn't even a feasible thing to some degree. And so getting people 65 and over vaccinated 2 weeks ago wasn't really feasible, and only set I'd say improper expectations. Although in the last week we started to get a lot more doses of the vaccine, and so the county has now started matching what the state level is, and so we'll talk about that in a few moments. On Tuesday evening, we had a relatively short council meeting, and it was to mainly approve our fiscal year 2020-21 grant program changes for our neighborhood grant program applications and our community grant applications. And so this is money that the city sets aside every year for neighborhoods to come together and to basically apply for either block parties or some event in their neighborhood, potlucks, something of that nature. And then from a community standpoint, it funds some of the downtown events like the tree lighting every year. So it does partial funding of kind of broader events, the bike to work day and other things of that nature that kind of build community throughout our city. And so council approved that, and that was kind of the main thing that we did Tuesday evening. And then yesterday, at the state level, state legislators approved, the housing package that the governor had been talking about, and it did multiple things. For one thing, of course, it extended that that deadline that was set to the eviction moratorium that was set to expire on the 31st, so on Sunday. It extended that to June 30th, so the end of June. But more importantly, it also dealt with some of the issues on rent relief. And so the eviction protection to June 30th, I think, was really important because it kind of, understanding that we are not back to where we need to be as far as, from an economy standpoint, as far as getting people back to work. But the other thing was starting to look at how to help both tenants and landlords that that basically have been hit because of COVID. And so tenants now will be eligible for protection through that June 30th by meeting several requirements. They must declare that they've lost income because of the pandemic, and I think that isn't that difficult. But they also need to pay at least 1/4 of the back rent owed between September and June. So that's important also, is they need to pay a portion of their rent. And under the new state measure, landlords can also receive 80% of back rent due between April 2020 and March of 2021. But they need to agree to waive, the remaining 20% of that debt. So for what was owed between April of 2020 and March of this year, landlords can, basically get paid, and this is coming from federal funds. So this is basically utilizing federal dollars that are coming to the states. And so landlords will be able to get, 80% of what's owed to them if they basically say they will write off that 20% remaining debt and not seek eviction. So that's really important. And if landlords refuse to waive that right to evict, then they can only collect 25% of that back rent. So it's a kind of a cost evaluation from a landlord standpoint. They should start distributing. The state should start distributing this aid in March. So that will help both some of the renters and help some of the landlords. And I've heard from both that have been really hit by COVID, whether or not it's people that own duplexes or fourplexes that their tenants haven't been able to pay. We have an ADU and we've actually reduced the rent during COVID. So it's hopefully you have understanding landlords, but there are landlords out there that also have mortgages to pay, and this is trying to at least assist them besides just assisting the tenants themselves. So state officials estimated that California renters owe about $400 million in back rent, but other researchers have said that that's closer to $1 billion. So hopefully, what the federal funds are going to do will help alleviate a portion of that. And then yesterday, from a council standpoint, we had an all-day session, and we have several all-day meetings during the year. Most of our meetings are, by charter, we have to have 2 evening meetings a year, or two evening meetings a month, all 12 months. So there's some cities that actually get to take the summer off. For us, we have 2 meetings a month, and that actually is good for for regularity of making sure that if there's anything that comes up, there's always a time frame to schedule that. And then during the year, we have 3 all-day sessions. So our first one, which we had yesterday, was the strategic session to talk about, the priorities for the city, and setting kind of priorities from a council standpoint for the upcoming year. Our second one is to talk about basically our study issues and budget and kind of doing ranking of that, and that will happen at the end of February. And then in May, we'll have our final budget session where we do a deep dive into the budget, and get, conceivably figure out whether or not whether or not there's going to be, additional things that we want to add, additional kind of job freeze or other things that we need to do in order to make sure that we're looking forward to next fiscal year, the 2021-2022 fiscal year. And then that, so that gives a lot of direction to staff for a final budget. And then we finally approve that in June. So, but there's those 3 all-day meetings. So yesterday's all meeting was the strategic session, and it's a really great overview. If you get a chance to watch, go back and watch that if you didn't attend. I know that there are actually a good number of residents who attended, who spoke at the beginning of the meeting, but it's a great overview of where the city stands in a lot of different areas, and allows council members to ask questions and give meaningful feedback on a variety of city issues. But it also gives kind of our first view of as far as the budget's concerned, and definitely, luckily from a end of last year's budget, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, we put aside a certain amount of funds into the budget stabilization fund, and conceivably, because and we'll find out more when we see the final budget, but it looks like, especially the TOT isn't coming in as well as we thought. Sales tax is actually looking better, and so this was a quick update of one of the many things that we went through throughout the day yesterday. But TOT isn't coming in as well as we thought, even with our conservative view, and so we'll see where that goes. And so we might actually have to go back into the budget stabilization fund in the upcoming year. And then, so that's the first part of the day was kind of going through the morning session was going through where the city stands. The afternoon was kind of on 3 different topics, one of which was a discussion on redistricting. The second was on the active transportation plan, and that was one of the things that I wanted to make sure we talked about from a council standpoint, and what staff's efforts are for the active transportation plan that council approved back in August. And lastly was kind of talking about an upcoming study issue that we've had that we'll be hearing back in May, but getting some general discussion, having some general discussion from a council standpoint on diversity and inclusion within our city. So I think that was a good discussion, and it kind of allows the hard thing about the Brown Act, that everything has to be agendized, and it's hard for council to kind of talk freely on a variety of topics, and that's what that strategic session is really there for. And so and then in the afternoon, late afternoon, we talked about our council policy priorities. And so, so in that changes, and we kind of tweak those every year. So just to give people kind of an update on our 6 different priorities, the Civic Center modernization has been a priority for multiple years, and finally, from the first phase of that, of a new city hall and an addition onto DPS, is moving forward. A second priority was open space acquisition planning and the future of golf courses, and that study will be coming back to us in May. Another thing is improved processes and services through the use of technology, and that has been kind of a priority over the last few years, trying to maximize technology to make what we do from a city standpoint that much better. Another policy priority is ability of infrastructure to support development and traffic, and that's an ongoing effort to make sure that our infrastructure and traffic are being handled accordingly. Downtown Sunnyvale has been a priority for multiple years now, and we finally approved the downtown specific plan update at the end of or in the fall of last year, and ultimately, phase one is completing from a city line standpoint, and now we're looking towards phase two, and then our last policy priority is accelerating climate action. And that's been a critical thing for our city for multiple years now. And, it was first doing the climate action playbook and then working on a yearly basis to implement all the great ideas and efforts to reduce our greenhouse gases, to do carbon sequestration, all the positive things that make our city more green. And so that's that was our six priorities, and we talked about tweaking several. So we added two. Well, we tweaked one, that the ability of infrastructure to support development and traffic and active transportation. So we added the active transportation to basically say, making sure we are focusing on that active transportation plan. And when we get to the budget, in May, it'll be what additional dollars we can see. But one of the things that staff gave was the long list of active transportation projects that we already have on our plate, and that's been really good. And we've been really successful in going out and getting grant funding, and for a lot of these different projects, from the Stevens Creek Trail to the Fair Oaks Bridge, to all these, to basically add better infrastructure. The East Channel on so the from the Valley Water East Channel, to make that ongoing vision of making that a pedestrian and bike area. And so there's been a lot of efforts throughout the last few years to add to that active transportation. And so adding that as a priority, especially now that we've added it, as now that we've approved that transportation plan, makes total sense. We also added equity, access, and inclusion, and I think that reflects, to me, is really important, because it reflects our efforts to kind of go to districts and make sure that we are hearing, from our residents. And if you look at the last few years, we've had the Unity event after our hate crime in 2019. Last year we had a series of Unity events to hear from different segments of our population on basically how our public safety operations work, what their concerns are. And I think this is at least highlighting that's really important from how our city operates. And we'll see how that kind of goes forth. We have a study issue coming back in May on that, so we'll hear from that. And then we also removed the open space acquisition planning and the future of golf courses. So we'll have the future of golf courses come back to us as a study issue later. I do think that we haven't acquisition of open space is still very critical. We've done very good in the last few years, either adding Seven Seas Park, adding Weiser Park, the AMD, the 6.5 acre park at AMD, the 2 acre park at Corn Palace. I think all those are positive things. I do think it's still a priority from a city standpoint to continue looking at acquisition of land wherever we can. There's so much infill happening that when we're dealing with any developer, trying to create parks, if there's new land that becomes available, trying to actually purchase that land to make sure that open space, whatever it is as large as possible and is usable for residents, I think is very critical. So as much as we remove that, and part of the golf course study was to look at ultimately in the long run how much we assist in golf course funds and funding. If you look at it from a parks in general, the usage of parks is free, and so those are negative to begin with. The golf course usage, especially over the summer, because it wasn't allowed activity during COVID-19 actually was very positive, and we had good weather all the way through December. So that actually meant that our funds from our golf courses were actually higher this year over the last year than what was previously estimated. So from that standpoint, we went through all those priorities, kind of reset those priorities, and I think it was a really good day. It was actually bringing on our two new district council members, and I think it actually helps getting a better view of the city overall. So I'm really happy that went very well. So, okay, let's go ahead and get to the health dashboard where we stand with testing and just general vaccinations. There's been lots of talk about vaccinations over the last week, and the county does not determine vaccine eligibility, as I've said before. That's basically dictated from the state. And the county has added a new vaccine dashboard, so it's definitely worthwhile to go see. It's SCC freevax.org, and there you can see all the qualifications, and you can also, most importantly, get a link to register for getting the vaccine if you qualify. So depending upon who your healthcare provider is. So and of course currently we're still in kind of phase 1A and phase 1B partial. So phase 1A is basically healthcare personnel, long-term care facility residents, frontline workers, I think, are the critical thing. And then going into phase 1B, it's talking about, phase, at least from Kaiser and Palo Alto Medical, it's residents over 75. And then from a county standpoint, it's residents 65 and older as well. And that's the county health system, El Camino Health, Stanford Healthcare. And so, that vaccine availability is changing rapidly, and all vaccinations are being done by appointment only. So that's critical because you need to be set up for your first and your second appointment. So it's really critical that that timing is completely being monitored by your healthcare provider or by the county. And so the county continues to update that site. It's very useful. It shows you how many vaccines, how many first doses have been distributed, how many second doses have been distributed. So it's actually really good from that standpoint. And then let's go on to cases from a national standpoint. We've had about almost 2.6 million cases. That's up over 1 million from last week of COVID, of positive COVID-19 cases, so that continues to increase, although it has leveled off a little bit. Nationally, we've surpassed 433,000 deaths, I think, and then California, we passed 3.25 million cases, and today we should be passing about 40,000 fatalities because of COVID-19. So it is difficult, and a lot of people know people that have been who have either been infected, who have had COVID-19, or actually have died by that. And then from a county standpoint, we definitely have been a little bit better. So we've just surpassed 100,000 from a county standpoint from their dashboard, but that's up only about 4,000 from a week ago. And so we've actually been doing a lot better. That's, if you look at the last few weeks, it was 7,000, it was 8,800, it was 7,500. So definitely we have kind of surpassed that surge after the holidays. So we're starting to see the downtick in the number of new cases, and we've had about 1,300 deaths. That's over 150 since just from a week ago. And then as far as hospitalizations, we're actually doing a lot better. So that's showing why one of the reasons why we moved back to the purple tier. 2 weeks ago we had 666, 266 people hospitalized because of COVID. a week ago it was 601, and now we're down to 503. So we're seeing a relative drop week to week as far as what our uh, ICU and hospitalization usage is due to COVID. So that's been very positive, and then it's just from a city standpoint, San Jose still has the highest at 66,000. That's up only about 3,000, just over 3,000 from last week, and that's way down from 5,000, 7,300, 6,500 from the weeks before. So we're definitely seeing a downtick. From a county standpoint, from a city standpoint, Sunnyvale has had 4,578 cases. That's up about 200 from last week, but that's about half as many, 400 the week before and 500 the week before that. So we're seeing that general downtick in new cases around the county and the number of people that are being hospitalized because of that. So and I continue to do a lot of advocating on your behalf. From a county level, we continue to have discussions on vaccinations and how we get those out to everyone in our community. And then as far as testing, the pop-up testing center was back at Murphy Park this past Monday, and they're here on the second and fourth Monday of every month from 9:30 to 4 p.m. It was completely full on this past Monday. They'll be back here on February 15th. So definitely, sign up for that if you can. And then El Camino Hospital is also providing free testing. They're doing that at their facility, so you can go online there. And from El Camino Hospital, they're also doing testing at Murphy Park. So they will be here on February 1st. They'll be here this upcoming Monday. And so it's all by appointment, and it's from 8:30 to 4:20 p.m. So, and it's no cost for anyone who lives, works, or goes to school in the El Camino Healthcare District. And so if you want to sign up, it is required that you schedule your appointment, and you can go, I posted earlier this week about the website, or you can call 650-940-7022, select option 4, and of course mention that you want to get tested in downtown Sunnyvale. So definitely, get tested if you think you've been exposed, especially if you're a healthcare worker, if you're a frontline worker working at restaurants. It's actually really good. If you've been out and in even going to the grocery and all that, sometimes there are lots of people there, and it's just good to generally get tested every few weeks, and if you're out and meeting other people, trying to keep your distance, but it's always good to be safe. And let me go ahead and next announce some upcoming events. So tomorrow at 10 a.m. There's so we have a Sunnyvale Sustainable Speaker Series, and so this is the first event for 2021. It's I think our second one for this fiscal year, but it's the event is Carbon Neutral Portfolio from Vision to Strategy. And so you can go online, but it's basically looking at how decarbonization is such a critical thing for removing fossil fuels from building energy and kind of switching appliances to only use clean electricity. So I think that this is one of the positive things. It's educational, and so we have usually about 3 or 4 speaker series events every year, and so I think this will be good if you have a chance. It starts at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, and you can sign up on the city website. And then on Monday, February 1st, we'll have the Moffett Park Specific Plan Transportation and Infrastructure Workshop, and so this is the second of 3 workshops. And if you want to learn more, you can go to moffittparksp.com, and this will go from 4 to 7 p.m. At 4 o'clock, it starts with a presentation from staff. At 5 o'clock or so, it'll be feedback from the residents asking questions, and then at 6 o'clock, it'll be basically a study session from council, giving direction kind of on what we've heard, what's been presented, back to council or back to city staff and consultants on what they would like to see from the Moffett Park specific plan. And then Tuesday night, we also have a council meeting, and it starts at 5:30 p.m. with a study session on the Mary Overpass. And so we've talked about this in the past, but the Mary Overpass is being studied for multiple kind of possibilities, and we'll have direction from council later in the spring. But ultimately, it's to look at whether or not it is a bike and ped path over. So it's where Mary ends to the north now. It would go all the way into Moffett Park, and whether or not it's a bike and ped path only, whether or not it's bike and peds and HOV shuttles, whether or not it's bike and ped and cars becomes the question. And so this is kind of the ongoing question, or there's no project at all. And so this is kind of an ongoing issue. The Mary Overpass has been part of our plan for since the 70s. So there's been a concept of a Mary Overpass, overcrossing going over 101 237 into Moffett Park. So that's been there for a long time. And so it's basically trying to decide what the environmental impacts of that are. And then at 7 p.m. we will further our discussions on redistricting. So that's a big portion of kind of creating an ordinance, and how, based upon the census data that from the 2020 census, by the end of this year, we'll have to redraw the new district lines that we came up with last year for our first set of district elections, and it'll all be based upon the new population counts. So that's important, and I think based upon discussions that we had at council yesterday, the majority of council basically said that they're interested in a hybrid solution with a citizens committee coming up with several maps that then go back to council, 2 or 3 maps that council with conceivably a best proposed alternative, and then council deciding on choosing one of those maps. So we'll see where that discussion goes on Tuesday, but ultimately, from a redistricting standpoint, it's key for us to create an ordinance that kind of defines that process, and then start basically define that ordinance. So it'll be giving direction to staff on coming up with an ordinance, and then basically approving that ordinance in, my guess is, I think February or March, and then creating that committee, and basically doing all the appropriate outreach so that we then create those new district boundary lines. Let's go ahead and get to the questions this week. First question I got from several people was, will Murphy Avenue will be closed again to car traffic and outdoor dining reopen? So that happened actually today. So as soon as we went back to the purple tier, I immediately was talking to our businesses, and they put in that request to the city to basically close that off to car traffic. So Murphy Avenue, the bollards went back up today, and definitely that's now reopened for outdoor dining, so so definitely throughout this week, restaurants had already moved to sidewalk dining, but now they can move out into the street like we enjoyed all summer long. Let's see what's happening with Fair Oaks Park unhoused. I've got this question from lots of people. Were lots of reports that the homeless have been swept or will be swept out of the park, and so there's been a lot of misinformation on this over the last few months. The city and I have been working on this issue with our several nonprofits, with the county. There were reports that the residents were already swept by our public safety. Our public safety has not done any, swept the homeless out of the park. We closed. We've been working. First we've been working with the county and our nonprofit partners to provide services to the unhoused individuals at the park, and then the city closed the majority of that park in November of 2019 for construction. Um, and that was mainly to deal with the renovation, and so there was a long-term renovation plan. However, to keep we basically kept that a portion of that park open, that encampment where we had unhoused people temporary open, and it was basically open, and we'll keep it open at least until the end of February, the way things are looking now. And this is part of the thing that we've been looking at, that it's not just about putting people into shelters or hotels. That's it's not the easy thing, but it is, logistically, that's only part of the issue. It's safely processing, their possessions, storing their possessions, but most importantly, it's providing and getting the county to provide the long-term services that these people need. And so that's been kind of the slow point in all this because of COVID. The county has really been, overwhelmed. And so, is making sure that we're not going to do anything until the county is basically guaranteeing us that they can provide those long-term services. So, and I've heard from residents it's like, well, FEMA will pay 100% of hotels. Well, that's great, but it's not just moving residents, the unhoused, into hotels. It's providing those services. It's dealing with their possessions and everything else. And so from our standpoint, it's doing the right thing, and and making sure that ultimately this transition, moving people, and people said, well, just leave them alone forever, and just do the rest of the park. Part of the problem is the PG. There's a good amount of utility work that needs to be done for the park, and the PG&E installation is all done all in that corner where the unhoused people are. And so in order for that work to get done, we definitely need people out of that area. And so PG&E is also problematic, that if you don't meet their timeline, they won't commit to future timelines. So once they've committed, and so this is part of the issue, we're trying to make it possible for PG&E to get their work done, so that all the undergrounding and power that's needed is done appropriately and at the right timing. So that's part of the logistics issue. So we have been working on that for a good portion of time now. What's happening with Wolf Road? I got this question. Basically, the PG&E undergrounding project on Wolf Road and Homestead, and that goes from not just from Homestead to El Camino Real, but Homestead, all the way to Old San Francisco. The current schedule was PG&E was supposed to complete that work. Well, supposed to happen last year. They finally finished or completing that design in February, and should be underway for the construction of undergrounding this spring. And so PG&E ultimately keeps changing that schedule, but it seems like that's finally locked in. And once they do the undergrounding, then it's their responsibility to kind of continue to redo those roads. And we have been doing patchwork on those roads, but ultimately, it's been really critical that we just didn't repave the roads and then immediately have them ripped up, which would have been just a waste of money at the end of the day. What is the work on Fair Oaks overpass to become? And so that's basically several things. Ultimately, there is an existing pedestrian and bike trail that's next to the current overpass, and part of this was seismic activity. So it's dealing with making sure that it's completely up to code from a seismic standpoint. The Fair Oaks Bridge over the Caltrain tracks. but it's also to add pedestrian and bike lanes there. So ultimately to make it a lot safer for pedestrians and bikes to travel over Fair Oaks. So that's the biggest thing. So it's a mixture of those things. Ultimately, um, the existing pedestrian ramp that's over that's kind of next to Home Depot will go away. There's certain issues with that also, and so ultimately it'll just be Fair Oaks, the Fair Oaks Bridge itself. And so that was funding that and work that started last year. It's on track, I think, to finish. I think in March or April this year. So we are on track of wrapping that project up. So I understand that that's affect a lot of kind of the way that traffic goes through that area, especially as they've had to close one half of it at times in order to do the appropriate construction. But that is going forward pretty much on schedule. The as much as I'm happy the rains are back, that the lack of rains over the last 6 months or so has actually been able to mean the Washington Park Swim Center, the Fair Oaks Bridge overcross, have kind of stayed on track from projects that the city has been working on. So that's been an actual positive thing of not having the rains that we would really have liked to had. And it's almost 10 o'clock. Let's go ahead and wrap up. Thanks again for joining me again this week. It's always interesting to see what new issues, what problems we have. As always, I'm proud of Sunnyvale's response to the pandemic. I know life continues to be difficult for so many of us. New issues come up, but your actions, your response do really make a difference. Continue to wear your mask, help your neighbors, share baked goods, continue to build our community and help others during these especially difficult times. But I continue to be proud of Sunnyvale residents pulling together. If you're out on a walk, wave, say hello. From a safe social distance. People really miss that safe social that social interaction. Sunnyvale will emerge from this as a stronger community. We're in this together. We will get through this together. Thanks for listening. Until next week, stay safe, stay warm, stay dry, and of course, wear your mask. Okay, take care. Until next week. Bye.